Imagine losing everything, your career, your reputation, your freedom, all because of a crime you didn't commit. What would you do if the world turned against you and the only way out was a fight you weren't sure you could win? Stay with me, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about power, justice, and survival. If you love justice and courage, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Let's dive in. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom creaked open as 16-year-old Malik Carter stepped inside. Dressed in an oversized hoodie, worn jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, he looked more like a kid sent to the principal's office than someone about to take on the fight of his life. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not in this way, at least. His mother, Diane Carter, sat at the defendant's table, hands trembling as she clutched a folder filled with legal documents she could barely understand. His younger sister, Nia, sat beside her, eyes filled with silent terror. The stakes were high, too high for a teenager to bear. And yet here he was. As Malik walked toward them, the murmurs started. Lawyers in crisp suits whispered behind their hands. Reporters scribbled in their notepads. A bailiff raised an eyebrow, glancing toward the judge for direction. And then there was Judge Harold Whitmore. Perched atop his high bench, the old man peered down at Malik through thin-rimmed glasses. His expression was one of instant disapproval. His furrowed brows and curled lip suggested he had already passed judgment on the young man before he had spoken a word. "Who's this?" the judge drawled, his voice dripping with condescension. "Somebody bring your child to court day?" A chuckle rippled through the courtroom. Malik clenched his fists but kept his face still. He had spent years perfecting the art of masking his emotions. Growing up in the roughest parts of the city had taught him that much. But today wasn't about surviving the streets. Today was about saving his family. He took a steadying breath, squared his shoulders, and turned to face the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear and unwavering. "My name is Malik Carter, and I will be representing the defendant." The courtroom went silent. For a moment, Judge Whitmore simply stared. Then he threw back his head and let out a sharp, barking laugh. "A teenager representing a client?" He smirked, shaking his head. "This isn't a high school debate club, kid. Where's the real attorney?" Malik felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The judge wasn't just laughing at him. He was mocking everything Malik represented. His age, his background, the color of his skin. But Malik was prepared for this. With quiet confidence, he pulled a folded document from his pocket and handed it to the court clerk, who carried it to the bench. Judge Whitmore squinted at the paper. His smug expression faltered as his eyes skimmed the words. His grip on the document tightened. "Is this a joke?" he muttered, rereading the page. The words were clear. Malik Carter, legal prodigy, had successfully passed the bar exam under a special exemption law for gifted youth. A hush fell over the room. Malik met the judge's stunned gaze, his voice steady. "No joke, Your Honor. Now, shall we begin?" Judge Whitmore still wasn't convinced. His beady eyes scrutinized Malik as if waiting for him to crumble under pressure. The courtroom had quieted, but the tension remained thick, almost suffocating. "Young man," the judge said slowly, tapping a gavel against his desk, "you expect me to believe that a 16-year-old from—" He glanced down at the case file. "Southside Bronx not only passed the bar, but is competent enough to argue a grand larceny case in my courtroom?" A low chuckle rippled through the audience, some of it mocking, some of it just stunned disbelief. Malik didn't let it shake him. "I don't expect you to believe anything, Your Honor," Malik responded smoothly, "but the New York State Bar Association does." The judge scoffed. "You could have forged this document." Malik didn't miss the subtle way he said "you," as if implying a black teenager from his neighborhood couldn't have possibly achieved this legally. He expected that. He had prepared for that. So instead of reacting, he simply turned to the court clerk. "I'd like the clerk to verify my credentials through the Bar Association's official database." The clerk hesitated, looking at the judge for approval. Whitmore waved a hand. "Go on. Let's put an end to this circus." The clerk quickly typed into the database, the entire courtroom waiting in silence. A few agonizing moments later, the clerk looked up, his face slightly paler. "His credentials check out," the clerk said. Malik Carter is officially recognized as a licensed attorney under New York's early bar admission program for exceptional youth. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the jury members exchanged stunned glances. Langston, the prosecutor, furrowed his brows. That program is practically unheard of. Only a handful of people have ever qualified. Malik cut in. Exactly. And I am one of them. Judge Whitmore still looked unconvinced, though now there was something else in his eyes. Suspicion. And how exactly did you manage that? The judge pressed. You expect me to believe some kid from the Bronx had the resources to study law and pass the bar exam? Malik's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. I don't expect you to believe it, Your Honor. I expect you to understand it after I explain. The courtroom leaned in. This was the part of the story few knew. My mother couldn't afford lawyers when she needed them the most, Malik began, his voice steady. When my father was wrongly convicted for a crime he didn't commit, we lost everything trying to appeal his case. I was 8 when I started reading law books. By 10, I was dissecting legal arguments in my free time. By 12, I was shadowing real attorneys online through open university programs. And by 14, I caught the attention of Professor Henry Calloway at Columbia Law School. At the mention of Calloway's name, a few attorneys in the room visibly tensed. He was a legend, one of the most respected legal minds in the country. He saw my potential, Malik continued. I was admitted into an experimental legal mentorship program, which granted me access to the coursework of law students. By 15, I passed the first-year law examination, and earlier this year, under sponsorship from the Legal Prodigy Foundation, I took and passed the bar. Langston crossed his arms. Sounds like a fairy tale. Malik turned to him, his dark brown eyes sharp. It sounds like hard work and sacrifice, 2 things I doubt you've ever had to rely on. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Langston's face darkened, but Malik didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, he turned back to the judge. You may not like me, Your Honor, he said, his voice measured, but the law is on my side. If you choose to remove me from this case, you won't be doing so because I'm unqualified. You'll be doing so because you don't want to see someone like me sitting at this table. A silence settled over the courtroom. Judge Whitmore exhaled sharply through his nose. His fingers tapped the bench as if weighing his options. Then, reluctantly, he leaned forward. You're on thin ice, Mr. Carter, but I will allow it. Malik simply nodded, his face betraying none of the relief flooding through his body. Judge Whitmore pinched the bridge of his nose, sighing. This is highly unorthodox. But not illegal, Malik interjected. The judge looked at him sharply. Malik could tell Whitmore wanted to shut him down, but the law was on his side, and the judge knew it. Langston clenched his jaw. He was used to steamrolling defense attorneys, especially overworked public defenders who barely had time to prepare. But this kid had done his homework. Fine, the judge said at last, voice laced with irritation. The court recognizes Malik Carter as the defense attorney for Diane Carter. But be warned, young man, this is not a game. If at any point I determine you are incapable of properly defending your client, I will not hesitate to remove you from this case. Malik nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Judge Whitmore turned to Langston. Prosecution, you may begin. Langston smirked, turning to the jury as he picked up his notes. Ladies and gentlemen, today we will see the facts for what they are. We are here because the defendant, Diane Carter, has been accused of grand larceny and fraud, serious charges that come with equally serious consequences. Diane flinched as gasps rippled through the audience. Naya clutched her mother's sleeve, looking at Malik with wide, pleading eyes. Langston continued, pacing as he spoke. The evidence against Mrs. Carter is overwhelming. Financial records, witness testimony, surveillance footage, everything points to one conclusion. She knowingly and willingly defrauded the clients of the investment firm where she worked. He paused, then turned his sharp gaze to Malik. And I highly doubt a teenager is capable of proving otherwise. A few chuckles broke out among the spectators, but Malik didn't react. He simply adjusted his tie and folded his hands on the defense table. Malik looked him in the eye, a quiet storm brewing behind his measured expression. I'll say, Malik replied coolly, that undeniable proof doesn't exist, and I'll prove it. A ripple of surprise swept through the room. Even Langston hesitated for a fraction of a second. And then, with a single nod from the judge, the trial began. Malik turned to his mother, her eyes glistening with pride and fear. He reached for her hand under the table and gave it a reassuring squeeze. Then, finally, he turned to the prosecution. It was time to tear their case apart. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the trial pressed forward. Malik sat with his hands folded neatly on the defense table, his mother beside him, her fingers clenched in her lap. Diane Carter, the woman who had worked tirelessly to provide for her family, was now being painted as a criminal. Malik had spent nights poring over every detail of the case, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses and turned toward the prosecution. "Mr. Langston, you may call your first witness." Peter Langston smirked as he rose from his seat, buttoning his expensive navy blue suit. He walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the jury, savoring the moment. The prosecution calls Mr. Gerald Parsons to the stand. A middle-aged man in a pressed gray suit stepped forward, his expression grave. He was a senior partner at the investment firm where Diane had worked, the man who had personally accused her of fraud. He took the oath and settled into the witness chair. Langston approached with a casual air, hands resting in his pockets. "Mr. Parsons, could you please state your position at Hamilton & Co. Investments?" Parsons cleared his throat. "I am the Chief Financial Officer. I oversee all major transactions and ensure our clients' money is handled properly." Langston nodded. "And in your professional opinion, what was Diane Carter's role in the company?" "She was a senior financial analyst. She had access to large accounts, and it was her responsibility to oversee transactions, monitor investments, and ensure compliance with regulations." Langston clasped his hands. "And is it true that, over the course of 6 months, large sums of money began disappearing from company accounts?" Parsons frowned. "Yes, nearly $500,000 was funneled into personal accounts through fraudulent transactions." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Malik kept his face unreadable. Langston turned to the jury. $500,000, gone. That's not a clerical error. That's theft." He faced Parsons again. "And who did the evidence point to?" Parsons hesitated, then looked directly at Diane Carter. "The transactions were linked to Mrs. Carter's login credentials. The withdrawals were made from her assigned workstation, and the money, traced to a private account, was under a name connected to her." Diane inhaled sharply. Naya gripped her hand tighter. Langston took a slow step back, letting the weight of the testimony settle. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore turned to Malik. "Counselor Carter, your witness." Malik stood smoothly, buttoning his jacket. He stepped forward, meeting Parsons' gaze with unwavering confidence. "Mr. Parsons," he began, his tone calm, "you've stated that my mother's credentials were used to execute these fraudulent transactions, correct?" Parsons nodded. "That's correct." Malik tilted his head. "Do you personally review every transaction that passes through the company's accounts?" Parsons blinked, caught off guard. "No, of course not. That's what our internal security systems are for." "So you rely on security logs to determine who made a transaction?" "Yes." Malik took a step forward. "Are you aware that login credentials can be stolen?" A few gasps rippled through the audience. Langston's smirk faltered. Parsons stiffened. Well, yes, but our systems—" "Let's talk about your systems," Malik interjected. He turned toward the jury. "Hamilton & Co. uses a keycard access system for employees, correct?" "Yes." Malik turned back. "And are you aware that on 2 of the days these transactions took place, my mother's keycard was logged entering the building while she was actually at home recovering from pneumonia?" The courtroom erupted into whispers. Parsons shifted in his seat. There could be a system error." Malik held up a document. "According to your company's own security report, there were no recorded system errors on those dates. So I ask again, how did my mother's keycard enter the building when she wasn't there?" Langston stood. "Objection. That is speculation." Malik turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I am simply pointing out an inconsistency in the evidence." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Overruled. Proceed." Malik walked to the defense table and picked up another file. "Mr. Parsons, do you know if my mother ever reported suspicious activity on her account?" Parsons hesitated. "Yes, but those reports were reviewed, and there was no conclusive evidence of hacking." Malik raised an eyebrow. But she did report it, and, coincidentally, the fraud occurred shortly after she raised concerns. Parsons' silence spoke volumes. Malik exhaled, then turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we have keycard access anomalies, security concerns dismissed, and transactions linked to an account that my mother never personally used. The prosecution claims they have undeniable proof. But I ask you, does this sound like an airtight case? The courtroom was silent. Malik turned back to Parsons. No further questions. As he returned to his seat, he caught the briefest flicker of uncertainty on Langston's face. Malik had just cracked a hole in the prosecution's case, and this was just the beginning. The courtroom remained thick with tension as Judge Whitmore called for a short recess. Malik sat beside his mother, his fingers drumming against the defense table. He had landed the first real blow against the prosecution, but he knew Langston wouldn't let that go unanswered. Diane turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Malik, what if they don't believe us?" He covered her hand with his. "They will. We just have to make them see the truth." The judge's gavel struck, calling the court back into session. Langston adjusted his tie and rose. The prosecution calls IT security specialist Kevin Aldridge to the stand. A man in his late 30s, with wire-rimmed glasses and a stiff posture, took the oath and sat down. Langston wasted no time. "Mr. Aldridge, you oversee cybersecurity at Hamilton & Co., correct?" "Yes," Aldridge replied. Langston nodded. "In your expert opinion, how secure is the company's login system?" Aldridge adjusted his glasses. "Extremely secure. Our multi-layer authentication process ensures that only authorized personnel can access accounts. Each login requires a personal keycard, a password, and biometric verification." Langston turned to the jury. "So if Diane Carter's credentials were used, what does that mean?" Aldridge hesitated for only a second. "It would mean she or someone with access to her credentials authorized those transactions." Langston smirked. "Thank you. No further questions." Malik stood, exhaling slowly as he approached the witness stand. "Mr. Aldridge, you mentioned biometric verification. Could you clarify what that entails?" Aldridge sat up straighter. "Yes, every employee must scan their fingerprint to log in." Malik nodded. "And has your system ever been compromised before?" Aldridge frowned. "Not to my knowledge." Malik took a step closer. "Really? Because I have here," he held up a printed report, "a security breach notice from 2 months before my mother's arrest. It states that an external party attempted to access company credentials using a phishing attack. Are you saying that wasn't a potential compromise?" Aldridge's jaw tightened. "We addressed that incident. No accounts were reported as compromised." Malik raised an eyebrow. "But can you guarantee that no one used stolen credentials before they were flagged?" Aldridge hesitated. "There's no way to be completely certain." Malik turned toward the jury. "So, we have a security system that isn't foolproof, a reported breach just months before this fraud was discovered, and yet, my mother is being accused without considering other possibilities." He turned back to Aldridge. "Tell me, Mr. Aldridge, if I had your username, password, and a way to fake a fingerprint scan, could I log in as you?" Aldridge swallowed. "Theoretically, yes." Malik stepped back. No further questions. The courtroom murmured with speculation. Langston's confidence faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning." The gavel struck. As the courtroom emptied, Nia squeezed Malik's shoulder. "You're tearing them apart." Malik exhaled. "Not enough. Not yet." But he knew one thing. He was getting closer. The next morning, Malik stood outside the courthouse, staring at the grand columns as sunlight bathed the building in gold. He inhaled deeply, bracing himself for what was to come. The prosecution had presented its evidence, and while he had managed to poke holes in their case, it wasn't enough. He needed a breakthrough. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled in their notebooks, cameras clicked, and whispers filled the air. The trial had captured the public's attention, and Malik knew the pressure was mounting. Judge Whitmore took his seat. "Mr. Carter, you may call your next witness." Malik rose, buttoning his jacket. "The defense calls Mr. Anthony Rise to the stand." A man in his early 40s, dressed in a charcoal suit, stepped forward. His face was sharp, his movements careful. He had once worked at Hamilton & Co. as an internal auditor before resigning under mysterious circumstances. Malik had spent weeks tracking him down. After Reyes was sworn in, Malik approached. Mr. Reyes, can you state your previous role at Hamilton and Co.? I was an internal auditor, Reyes said, his voice steady. And what were your responsibilities? I reviewed financial transactions, monitored irregularities, and ensured compliance with corporate policies. Malik clasped his hands behind his back. Did you ever notice suspicious activities while you were there? Reyes hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. Yes, there were irregular transactions, large sums being moved between accounts with no clear justification. A murmur spread through the courtroom. Langston's jaw tightened. Malik stepped closer. Did you report these irregularities? Yes. And what happened after you did? Reyes glanced at Diane, then back at Malik. I was told to drop it. When I pushed for further investigation, I was pressured to resign. Malik let that hang in the air. Then he pulled out a document and handed it to the judge. Your Honor, this is Mr. Reyes's resignation letter. Notice the date, just 1 week before the fraudulent transactions allegedly tied to my mother began. Gasps filled the room. Langston shot to his feet. Objection. This is irrelevant and speculative. Judge Whitmore peered over his glasses. Overruled. Continue, Mr. Carter. Malik turned back to Reyes. Did you ever find out who was responsible for these irregular transactions? Reyes nodded slowly. Yes, the patterns pointed to someone higher up in the company, but before I could gather enough evidence, I was forced out. Malik's heart pounded. This was it. Mr. Reyes, do you believe my mother was framed? Langston stood again. Objection. Calls for speculation. Judge Whitmore hesitated, then nodded. Sustained. Malik exhaled, then rephrased. Did you ever see any direct evidence linking my mother to the fraudulent transactions? No, Reyes said firmly. There was no direct evidence against her, only access logs and manipulated reports. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Malik turned to the jury, letting the weight of Reyes's testimony sink in. No further questions. As Malik returned to his seat, he caught Langston's expression, tight-lipped, fists clenched. The prosecution's case was unraveling, and Malik was just getting started. Langston stood slowly, adjusting his tie, masking his frustration with a well-practiced smirk. He walked toward Reyes with an air of confidence, but Malik could see it. His composure was slipping. Mr. Reyes, Langston began, you claim that you noticed irregularities before your resignation. Yet, in the months following, no formal report from you was submitted to any financial oversight agency. Why? Reyes shifted in his seat. Because I was threatened. A hush fell over the courtroom. Malik leaned forward. Langston raised an eyebrow. Threatened? Reyes nodded. After I submitted my initial report, I received an anonymous message. It was clear. If I valued my career, I would stop asking questions. Langston chuckled, feigning amusement. So let me get this straight. You, an experienced auditor, found evidence of massive fraud but walked away because of an anonymous message? Reyes's jaw tightened. I didn't just walk away. I was blacklisted. No firm in the city would hire me. My reputation was destroyed. Langston sighed dramatically. And yet you have no evidence of these threats? Reyes exhaled. I do. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. Copies of emails, internal reports, and messages I received. Langston's smirk vanished. Malik's heart pounded. He hadn't known about this. Langston quickly recovered, turning toward the judge. Your Honor, the defense has not submitted this evidence in discovery. Judge Whitmore peered at Malik. Counselor Carter? Malik stood. Your Honor, I was unaware of this evidence until this moment. However, if allowed, I can authenticate its contents. The judge considered for a moment before nodding. I will allow it. Bailiff, please collect the drive. As the bailiff took the USB to be analyzed, Langston clenched his fists. He had been in control of the case until now. Malik watched as Langston straightened, adjusting his strategy. Mr. Reyes, in your time at Hamilton and Co., did you ever interact directly with Mrs. Carter? Rarely. She was respected, known for her integrity. She wasn't the type to steal. Langston turned to the jury. And yet, despite all your theories, the financial trail still leads to her. Reyes met his gaze, or to whoever framed her. A ripple went through the audience. Langston clenched his jaw. No further questions. As Malik sat back down, he caught his mother's eyes. Hope flickered in them for the first time. They had just shaken the foundation of the prosecution's case, and Malik knew the real culprit was getting nervous. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Malik glanced at the USB drive now being reviewed by the court technician. If the contents were as damning as Ray suggested, then everything was about to change. Langston sat stiffly, flipping through his notes, but his usual smugness was gone. He knew he had lost the upper hand. Judge Whitmore turned toward Malik. "Counselor Carter, you may call your next witness." Malik rose, buttoning his jacket. "The defense calls Catherine Monroe to the stand." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in her early 40s, dressed in a sleek navy dress, strode forward. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sharp bun, her expression unreadable. Catherine Monroe was the chief compliance officer at Hamilton & Co., and one of the firm's most powerful figures. Malik watched her as she took the oath. She was composed, but he saw the flicker of unease in her eyes. He approached, maintaining a calm but firm demeanor. "Ms. Monroe, could you please state your role at Hamilton & Co.?" She folded her hands neatly. "I oversee regulatory compliance, ensuring that all financial transactions align with federal and corporate policies." Malik nodded. "So you would be aware of any fraudulent activity within the company?" Monroe hesitated for a fraction of a second. "If it came to my attention, yes." Malik walked to the defense table, picking up a document. "Are you aware that an internal audit flagged multiple discrepancies in company transactions 6 months before my mother's arrest?" Monroe's jaw tightened. "I was aware of certain anomalies, but nothing substantial." Malik held up another document. "This is an email sent to you by Mr. Reyes detailing those anomalies. He requested an immediate investigation. Do you remember receiving this?" She hesitated. "I receive hundreds of emails. I can't recall each one." Malik stepped closer. "Then let me refresh your memory." The bailiff handed him a printed copy of an email from Reyes to Monroe. It was clear and damning, a full report warning of unauthorized transactions, all flagged months before Diane Carter was accused. Malik turned to the jury. This email was ignored. Instead of launching an investigation, Ms. Monroe dismissed the concerns and later testified that my mother was the only possible suspect. Monroe stiffened. "Those transactions were linked to her credentials." Malik exhaled sharply. "And yet, there's evidence her credentials were compromised. Ms. Monroe, were you aware of the security breaches in your company?" A bead of sweat appeared at her temple. "No, I was not." Malik gave a humorless chuckle. "Strange, because according to the USB drive submitted moments ago, your own credentials were used to approve multiple fraudulent transactions, ones that mirrored the ones my mother was accused of." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Monroe's lips parted slightly, her confidence cracking. "That's impossible." Malik turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request a full forensic analysis of this evidence." Langston shot to his feet. "Objection. This is—" Judge Whitmore held up a hand. "Overruled. The court will review the contents." He turned to Monroe. "Miss Monroe, I suggest you choose your next words carefully." Monroe's hands trembled as she gripped the stand. Malik saw it. The mask was slipping. She wasn't just nervous, she was guilty, and everyone in the room knew it. The courtroom was deathly silent, all eyes fixed on Catherine Monroe. The weight of Malik's accusation bore down on her, and for the first time since taking the stand, she looked unsure. Judge Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Ms. Monroe, do you have an explanation for these allegations?" Monroe swallowed hard, her once polished composure now cracking under the scrutiny. She turned to Langston, who remained motionless, his jaw clenched. He knew she was cornered. Malik took a step forward, pressing his advantage. "Miss Monroe, if you had nothing to hide, why wasn't Mr. Reyes' audit report taken seriously? Why were warnings about security breaches ignored?" She shook her head slightly. I didn't." "Didn't what?" Malik pressed. "Didn't want an investigation because you knew it would lead to you?" Monroe's fingers clenched around the edge of the witness stand. "That's not true," she snapped, her voice betraying her growing panic. Malik walked back to his table and picked up another document. "Let's talk about the fraudulent account where the stolen money was funneled. The prosecution has argued that it was linked to my mother, but records show that its true beneficiary was a shell company, one with ties to you." Another wave of murmurs spread across the courtroom. Monroe's face drained of color. Malik continued, his voice unwavering. "According to banking records, this account was opened 6 months before the fraud began, using an alias linked to offshore holdings that you control." Judge Whitmore turned sharply to Monroe. "Miss Monroe, is this true?" She hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Her gaze darted around the room as though searching for an escape. Langston remained silent, staring ahead as if distancing himself from the disaster unfolding in front of him. Malik delivered the final blow. "Miss Monroe, I'll ask you directly. Did you frame my mother to cover your tracks?" A single second stretched into eternity. "Yes," Monroe whispered. A collective gasp erupted from the audience. "Yes," she blurted, her voice breaking. "I had no choice. The firm was in trouble. Some risky investments went bad, and I needed to move money, fast. I only meant to shift funds temporarily, but when Reyes flagged the discrepancies, I panicked. And then your mother started raising concerns, and I had to do something." Diane let out a sharp breath, gripping Naya's hand as tears welled in her eyes. Malik forced himself to stay calm, though his heart pounded in his chest. Judge Whitmore's face was unreadable as he turned to the bailiff. "Take Miss Monroe into custody. She will be formally charged pending further investigation." The bailiff moved swiftly, gripping Monroe's arm as she collapsed back into her chair, her once powerful presence reduced to nothing. Langston stood abruptly, shoving his papers into his briefcase. "Your Honor, given this development, the prosecution moves to dismiss all charges against Diane Carter." Malik turned to his mother, his breath catching as the reality settled in. She was free. Judge Whitmore nodded. Motion granted, case dismissed. The courtroom erupted into cheers. Diane broke into quiet sobs, clutching Malik's hands as Naya wrapped her arms around both of them. Malik closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling deeply. The battle was over, and justice had finally been served. The courtroom had emptied, but Malik remained seated, his hands resting on the defense table. His mother was free, and Monroe had confessed, yet his mind still churned with the weight of everything that had happened. He glanced toward the witness stand where Hector Reyes had sat just hours earlier. The man had looked defeated, his gaunt face a shadow of the brilliant forensic auditor he once was. Malik had wondered why Reyes would risk testifying. He had every reason to stay silent, to protect himself. But as they spoke before the trial, Reyes had admitted the truth. "I have nothing left to lose," he had said, his voice hollow. "Monroe and her people blacklisted me. No firm will touch me, no bank will hire me. They took my reputation, my career, my life. If they want me dead, so be it. At least I'll go knowing I did one thing right." Malik had seen the flicker of resolve in his eyes, the kind that came from a man who had already lost everything. Reyes had chosen to fight, even if it cost him. And then there was Judge Whitmore, a man who, from the very start, had made his prejudices clear in subtle ways. The way he barely looked at Malik when he spoke, the way he dismissed Diane's distress as unfortunate. Yet something had shifted. As the case unraveled, Whitmore had grown quieter, more introspective. After the trial, Malik overheard two clerks whispering outside the courtroom. "Did you hear? Whitmore's retiring next month." "Yeah, guess he didn't want this trial to be his legacy." The realization hit Malik. The judge had seen an opportunity, not just to correct his own biases, but to walk away with his head held high. In his final act as a judge, he had chosen justice. And Catherine Monroe, Malik had expected her to fight until the bitter end, to deny everything, to drag the trial out. But when she cracked on the stand, when she admitted the truth, he knew something bigger was at play. Her confession hadn't been out of guilt. It had been survival. After the trial, Malik received a tip from an anonymous source, someone who had worked under Monroe. She was supposed to return some of the stolen money, the message read. But she got greedy? The people she worked with, they don't forgive debts. They were coming for her. Prison was her only safe haven. Malik closed his eyes, exhaling. Justice had been served, but at what cost? Reyes had nothing left. Whitmore would fade into quiet retirement, and Monroe had chosen a cage over a grave. He looked at his mother, who sat beside him, gripping Nia's hand tightly. She was free. That was all that mattered. Malik reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "It's over." Diane looked at him, tears welling in her eyes. "You did it." "No, Mom," he said softly. "We did." As they stepped out of the courtroom into the cool evening air, Malik knew one thing for certain. He had won the case. But the fight for justice was never truly over, and he would be ready for the next battle. So what do you think? In a world where justice isn't always fair, Would you have taken the risks Malik did, or would you have walked away? Drop a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. If this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more gripping stories like this. Turn on notifications so you never miss an upload, because trust me, the next story might be even crazier than this one. Thanks for watching, and remember, in the fight for justice, sometimes the truth is the most dangerous weapon of all. See you in the next one.